Welcome back to another video. Today is going to be a very quick introduction about how to use HTTP nodes to access an API. I've received some questions on my last video, the LinkedIn article generator. People wanted to know if it was possible to use relevant articles on the internet to use as like the foundation for writing their new article. And there are actually several AI search engines which allow you to do this. And most, if not all of them, are accessible through an API. I think the most commonly known are Perplexity and Tavily. In this video, I'll show you how to connect to the Tavily API so you can actually scrape for relevant news articles that were posted within the last 3, 7, 10 days, whatever you set as a parameter. The reason I'm using Tavily over Perplexity is just because in this example, I like it more for finding relevant news articles. As always, I'll first show you quickly how it works, and then I'll go over how to set it up and replicate this for yourself. Here in my Airtable, I've written down a topic that I want to write a LinkedIn post about, or for example, a tweet, or it could also be a TikTok video script. This could be anything you desire. But before I can do that, or I can let the AI do that, I need some relevant information. That's why we're going to put this AI automation as a search query into the Tavily API. So here we are back in N8N, and to keep it as simple as possible, because the focus for today is really on this HTTP request node, I simply asked the Airtable node to get me a certain record, which in this case was the topic that I entered, the AI automations in sales. Then I simply press like test node on the HTTP request node, and it's going to take a while, but as you can see, node executed successfully. And after just a few seconds, we've got the outcome, which I'll go over in a bit. So I'm taking a moment to briefly zoom out again to give you guys some perspective on how you can implement this very tiny combination of two nodes, essentially, into a much larger, much more elaborate workflow. Think, for example, of swapping this when clicking test flow trigger for a Telegram chat. Let's say you have Telegram on your phone and suddenly during dinner you think of a topic you want to write an article about or a tweet, whatever. You can just enter in your Telegram chat the topic and tell it to upload it to your Airtable to then follow the steps we'll go over in a bit. And then on the other end of this workflow, after the HTTP node, you could imagine adding one or several AI agents to write you whatever piece of content you can imagine. I've already talked about LinkedIn posts, LinkedIn articles. You can ask it to write a TikTok script for a video you can make in the future. Same goes for YouTube. You can ask it to write blog posts. Your imagination is literally your barrier. I'm mentioning implementing this into a larger workflow just to give you guys some inspiration on how you can implement this for your daily needs or your business needs, because I understand it can be difficult. Now back to the topic of today, using an HTTP node to access an API. Since the Airtable node is really not relevant for today, I'll skip over it and go straight to the setup of the HTTP node. Before I do that, I'll show you the API documentation of Tavily, the API we're going to access with the HTTP node. So what you see here on screen is the openly available API documentation of the Tavily API. It can be quite daunting to some people, I understand. That's why I wanted to show you this so we can break it down together. So to set up the HTTP node, you need a few things. You need a URL and you need parameters. Well, as we can see at the top of this page, it talks about a base URL, which we can just copy and paste into the HTTP node later on. Now for the parameters, as you can see, there are quite a few listed, and sometimes it says required, and for others it says optional. It goes without saying that the ones which say required are required for you to put into the HTTP node, and for the optional ones you can choose and pick which one you think are most appropriate for your search. When in the HTTP node, I'll show you which one I chose, and I'll give you some explanation about why I only chose them and I left out the others. Scrolling further down the page, you can see the response, and you can actually see an example of both the usage and the response, how it would look. Now that we went over how to understand an API documentation page, we'll go back to the N8N workflow and we'll dive into the HTTP node. So back in the HTTP node, let's just implement what we just read on the API documentation. First of all, as method, we set post. That's what we just read. For URL, we paste the base URL, and the only thing we add is search, because we're going to do a search. It was in the documentation. I just forgot to mention it. But if you go back a few seconds in this video, you can read it yourself. And then under JSON, we just copy the 2 required parameters, and the rest is the optional ones. Let me expand this so you can see it more clearly. So as you can see, the required parameters are the API key and the query. In this case, it's a variable. I've went over this in previous videos. You can see that this query is from the Airtable, the topics, and it translates into the AI automation in sales, which was the topic I entered into my Airtable sheet. So for search depth, I want it to be basic. So everything that's in parentheses at the end, so after these parameters, is just from documentation straight. I just copied it. There's a bit of explanation on there, but for example, the topic is news because I wanted to collect me news articles. For days, I picked 7 because the oldest news article can only be 7 days old. We want the news to be relevant, of course. And then I wanted to include raw content, which is just the HTML of the page, which I can then later input in an LLM to write me a more elaborate article. And for max results, I've chosen 3 because I think 3 is more than enough. Then the only thing that rests is to click test step and wait for the outcome. Before I forget, the API key, which I've used here, it's always personal, and you can find it usually just in your account settings. There's always something labeled API code or API key. Just copy and paste it over here. So back to the output. To get the output like this, in an easy overview, I've clicked on schema. We can see that what our query was. And for answer is just like a summary of all 3 articles. 3 in this case because we asked it to output 3 articles. It returned the URL of the article so we can go read it for ourselves. It returned the raw content, which in this case is parsed HTML. Parsed HTML just means that most of the code was already taken out of it for you, so you don't have to add a code node after this. I've showed some examples of that in previous videos. It has given you the title and the published date. As you can see, it's less than 7 days ago. And the same goes for the other 2 results. I've already mentioned it a few times before, but what you can do with this output, for example, is add an AI agent after this node. So I'll quickly show you. And just use the input, the output from the HTTP node as input for the AI agent to make it write you an article, a YouTube script, whatever you can imagine. And it will be based upon the relevant articles that you just searched through the Tavily API, allowing you to consistently output content for your personal brand or for your business, for example. If you've watched all the way through the end, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future videos, you can always post them in the comments. I read and react to everything. Before I forget, I also do consultations. So if you're stuck on a project or you just want to bounce some ideas off of me, that's possible. There's a link to it in the description below. And all that remains is thanking you for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.